Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is addressed to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm that in the past few weeks alone it's been revealed that weak wages growth has slowed even further, business capital expenditure is now 30% lower than when this government came to office, retail trade has gone backwards with the worst result in 30 years, and Labor productivity has declined for the first time since records began?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I can confirm that after the election, people's taxes didn't go up, Mr Speaker. I can confirm that after the election, Mr Speaker, the National Skills Commission was established and we've brought forward some $9.5 billion worth of investment in support of the Australian economy. I can confirm that thousands upon thousands of people have got extra jobs, Mr Speaker, in this economy. Mr Speaker, I can confirm that businesses in this country kept putting people into work as a result of not having to face the higher taxes of what those opposite were proposing to do at the last election. I can confirm that in the most recent figures, the capital city house prices have gone up by 2%, Mr Speaker. That's the strongest result since 2003. And I can confirm that because at the last election, Australians had a choice. Did they want a government led by the Labor Party that wanted to increase their taxes, Mr Speaker, thinking that was what the economy needed at the time when the economy was facing great challenges both overseas and at home, in particular with the drought? And Australians rightly concluded they shouldn't. They believed they should have a government that wanted to invest $100 billion in infrastructure, to proceed on with trade agreements, whether it was in Indonesia or other countries, to ensure we expanded the frontiers of our economy. Every single time, it would seem, Mr Speaker, we have to drag the Labor Party kicking and screaming to support these trade agreements, Mr Speaker. They tried to start plenty, Mr Speaker, but they couldn't conclude any, Mr Speaker. And the reason they had that trouble is within their own ranks. They remain divided. They remain divided on the taxes that they still want to put on the Australian people. They remain divided on the issues of climate policy, Mr Speaker, of which there's about 7 different positions across the opposition. They remain divided on whether we should be a friend of China or we should be a foe of China, Mr Speaker. They can't even deliver a coherent international policy. The Australian people got it right on the 18th May, Mr Speaker. They voted to keep the economy strong in the hands of Australian politicians who know how to handle the money, and that's the Liberal and the Nationals, Mr Speaker. The Australian people know that they cannot trust Labor with money, and they know, Mr Speaker, the second the Labor Party gets their hand on the Treasury benches, they get their hands on the wallets of Australians. They do not trust Labor with money, Mr Speaker, but they do trust this government. And in the difficult times that we face as a country, they know that our stable and certain economic management is the policies that are needed at this very important time for their economic futures.
The member for Monash.
Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, will you update the House on how the Morrison government is building our national, economic and environmental security, both now and into the future, to deliver the stability and certainty Australians need to plan their future with great confidence?
Members on my left, the Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Monash for his question. Mr Speaker, in the last 6 months since we were re-elected as a government, we have delivered that tax relief for Australians that we promised. Generational changes in their tax to ensure that they can keep more of what they earn, Mr Speaker. On top of that, we have brought forward the infrastructure investment, some $3.8 billion into the forward estimates and about $1.8 billion in this year alone, Mr Speaker, and next year. That is important investments in the future of our economy which bring benefits today and they bring benefits tomorrow, as opposed to the fiscal stimulus measures pursued by the Labor Party when they were in government, Mr Speaker, which was a moment on the lips, Mr Speaker, and a decade on the debt of this country and more, Mr Speaker. So we have been delivering the important investments in our economy. We have seen a resurgence back in the confidence in the housing market, which has been noted by economists, Mr Speaker, as one of the key ingredients to boosting confidence more generally in the economy. And the reason for that is we did not pursue the higher taxing policies on housing which Labor was seeking to do at the last election, and the sense of relief of Australians that their housing wouldn't be hit with higher taxes, that their investments wouldn't be hit with higher taxes they'd worked hard for, and, Mr Speaker, all of those matters had been addressed. Mr Speaker, the Deloitte Fiscal Monitor today says the government's economic policy settings are right, and our policies of tax cuts and accelerated and increased infrastructure investment are helping to underpin our economic growth. But it's not just that, Mr Speaker. On national security, today we announced the Countering Foreign Interference Task Force, which builds on the work we've been doing to give our agencies the tools and the resources to counter the evolving threat of foreign interference. On top of that, we have passed the temporary exclusion orders into law to ensure that we're protected against, in these cases, the return of foreign fighters. We have, Mr Speaker, acted on child sexual exploitation laws, and we've released and are acting on the Illicit Drugs Action Plan. But I also note, when it comes to emissions reduction, Mr Speaker, that the latest inventory of Australia's emissions shows that in the year to June 2019, economy-wide emissions fell 0.1% or 0.4 million tonnes, Mr Speaker, and it is lower than it was at the time we came to government in 2013 and has fallen for the past 2 years, Mr Speaker. And on top of that, since the election, we have announced a ban on the export of waste of plastic, glass, paper and tyres, Mr Speaker. Now, Mr Speaker, these are the things we're doing to act on the security of Australians, whether it's on their national security, their safety, on their economic security or their environmental securities. In the last 6 months, Mr Speaker, we've been getting on with it. The Labor Party have been playing political games.
The member for Rankin.
Yeah, thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Given the Finance Minister's boast that low wages growth is a, quote, deliberate design feature of the government's economic management, and the Reserve Bank's recent statement that low wages growth under those opposite is now, quote, the new normal, is this a case of mission accomplished?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, I thank the member for Rankin and I thank the Leader of the Opposition for letting him out of witness protection, Mr Speaker, because he's been averaging one question a sitting week since the election. Not bad for a shadow Treasurer, Mr Speaker. He's been kept in the dark. Now, he asked about wages. Let me inform the House that real wages have been growing at 0.6%, which is around the historical average, and when we came to government it was only 0.5%, Mr Speaker. Real minimum wages have increased every year under us, whereas under the Labor Party, 3 out of 6 years they went backward, Mr Speaker, and we now have one of the highest, if not the highest, minimum wage in the world, Mr Speaker. Now, compensation of employees, which is the wages bill of the economy, according to the last national accounts, was at 5%. This compares to 3.5%, Mr Speaker, when we came to government. Now, employment growth, Mr Speaker, because we know that jobs are so important for the Australian people, Mr Speaker. Employment growth today in Australia is at 2%. That compares to an OECD average of 0.9%, Mr Speaker. And you know what it was when we came to government? What it was under Labor? 0.7%, Mr Speaker, nearly a third of what it is today, and we know that we've helped create more than 1.4 million new jobs. 34 out of the last 36 months have seen jobs growth, Mr Speaker, whereas under the Labor Party, 6 out of their last 12 months saw negative jobs numbers, Mr Speaker. And when it comes to the participation rate is now at a record high, around 66%. Again, when we came to government, it was 64.8%. Female participation, Mr Speaker, is now at a record high, and employment growth of females has been around 2/3 of the overall employment growth over the past year, Mr Speaker, and female participation is at 61.2%, whereas under Labor it was at 58.7%. So, Mr Speaker, I know the member for Rankin rarely gets a question, but when he does, I appreciate it.
The member for Reid.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Minister explain the Morrison government's strong budgetary management and why a stable and certain approach is essential to ensuring our economy remains resilient against future challenges? Is the Treasurer aware of any alternative policies?
The Treasurer has the call.
Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Reid for her question, acknowledge her background in small business and also acknowledge in her electorate more than 80,000 taxpayers are getting a tax cut as a result of legislation that we on this side of the House have supported. And more than 20,000 small businesses in the electorate of Reid are going to be able to access the instant asset write-off which we extended in this year's budget. Now, Mr Speaker, when we came to government, unemployment had been rising under Labor, investment had been falling, and they had racked up $240 billion in accumulated deficits. In contrast, since we've come to government, we now have the first current account surplus in 40 years, Mr Speaker. We now have welfare dependency at its lowest level in 30 years, Mr Speaker. We have passed through the parliament tax cuts, which are the biggest in more than 20 years, Mr Speaker, and we have the first balanced budget in 11 years, Mr Speaker, and we will deliver the first surplus in 12 years, Mr Speaker. And unlike those opposite, if they ever got the chance with their housing tax, housing prices would have fallen. Under this government, housing prices have been rising, Mr Speaker, helping to boost the confidence of the Australian people, Mr Speaker. Now, we know that today that the Deloitte have put out their report, which have said not only that the decade of deficit should end, but that budget surpluses help protect prosperity, Mr Speaker. They also said that there is a growth momentum in the Australian economy which has been lifting, and that through the tax cuts which we on this side of the House support and which those opposite were against, Mr Speaker, the Australian economy is stronger as a result of those tax cuts. Now, we also know that the words of Deloitte are consistent with what Standard & Poor's said just over a week ago, that the Australian outlook, the economic outlook, is sound, Mr Speaker, and that strong fiscal outcomes are really important to Australia maintaining its AAA credit rating. Now, Mr Speaker, these numbers show that the Australian economy continues to grow. Indeed, the IMF and the OECD have said that our growth in 2020 will be higher than any G7 nation. Now, Mr Speaker, just think if the Australian people and the Australian economy had to handle Labor's $387 billion of higher taxes on their housing, on retirees, on income earners, Mr Speaker, on family businesses and on superannuation. Now, Mr Speaker, we know the member for Rankin. He wants to hold on to that $387 billion because with the member for McMahon who's looking at his phone, they were the co-architects. They were the co-architects of those higher taxes. So we know that the member for Rankin is telling the Leader of the Opposition, don't give up those taxes. I want those higher taxes. But, Mr Speaker, if you want lower taxes, then only the coalition will deliver more jobs and lower taxes.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister, and it goes to his answer to my first question, where he said, and I quote, "They tried to start plenty, but they couldn't conclude any about trade." That's not true, Prime Minister, is it? Isn't it a fact that we concluded the Chile Agreement in 2009, ASEAN, Australia and New Zealand, including Brunei, Burma, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore and Vietnam, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia in 2010 and 2013, the Malaysia Agreement.
The members on my left, member for Sydney. The Prime Minister has the call.
What I know is when we came to government, 26% of our trade was covered by trade agreements. Right now, it's at 70%, Mr Speaker. At 70%, Mr Speaker.
Members on my left, the Prime Minister will resume his seat. Members on my left, the member for Griffith. The member for Sydney. I feel I just should say it every 10 seconds at the moment. Member for Sydney's warned the Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker. I invited the Prime Minister to correct the record. He has misled Parliament. I don't suggest it's deliberate.
The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. No, the Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. Members on my left, the Leader of the Opposition's asked his question. The Prime Minister is only about 20 or 25 seconds into the answer, and the Prime Minister is being certainly relevant to the policy topic. I call the Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, start and finish is the test, Mr. Speaker. When you start an agreement and finish an agreement, then I suppose you can claim those. I'm happy to acknowledge that some were concluded under the former Labor government, Mr. Speaker, but what I can acknowledge also is when they left government, just 26% of our trade was covered by trade agreements. It's 70% now, Mr. Speaker. When it comes to trade, the Labor Party were a dud.
It's the independence question, but just before I... Oh, OK. Let me just inform the House we have present in the gallery this afternoon the Fijian Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and Defence, led by the Chair, the Honourable Alexander O'Connor. On behalf of the House, a very warm welcome to you all. And I call the member for Groom.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. Well, the Deputy Prime Minister outlined the Morrison-McCormack government's achievements on delivering critical infrastructure for regional Australia, including building the inland rail. And how will the government continue to work in a stable and certain way to address those real issues of importance to regional Australia?
The Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Good morning. Cereals. They've all gone too early, Mr. Speaker, like normally. Good morning cereals in Toowoomba. Mr. Speaker, it's owned by Michael and Jill Allwright. Now, they've got a wonderful little business, a niche business. They puff organic grain. And what they do is by puffing that organic grain, it makes it 8 times more volume than the original grain, and which of course makes it 8 times more expensive then to transfer, Mr. Speaker, from their Toowoomba factory to Melbourne. And they are going to be benefiting from the inland rail, Mr. Speaker, which is going to bring down costs by, well, it was predicated on $10 tonne per saving. It's actually going to be up for post-processed food up to $94 a tonne per saving, according to the CSIRO's report last year, but indeed an average of $76 a tonne per saving. And that's thrilled Jill Allwright, Mr. Speaker, because she knows that any cost is going to affect her bottom line, and any saving, of course, is going to be beneficial to her business. And when 20% of their profits, of their turnover, are going into the freight line, it's going to be beneficial for her business to make sure that she has that saving. And she's very much looking forward to inland rail coming through Toowoomba. She decentralised that business with her husband Michael in 2012. Another great regional decentralisation story on the back of public taking a risk in their own selves, Mr. Speaker. I was with the member for Groom just last Friday, Mr. Speaker, when we signed the intergovernmental agreement with Queensland. Minister Mark Bailey was there with us signing the inland rail agreement following on from Victoria. They were first up, and then of course New South Wales signed that intergovernmental agreement to allow us to get on with the job of building this $9.3 billion nation-building piece of infrastructure. Now, it was first talked about in the 1890s, plans were first drawn up in the early 1900s, and it's taken a Liberal Nationals government to get on with the job of building it. Now that we've got those states signed up, Mr. Speaker, this $9.3 billion facility is going to be built, and that's going to bring considerable savings, particularly for regional Australia, Mr. Speaker. The Parks to Narromine section, already $46.7 million. $46.7 million has gone into local businesses such as Calvany Crushing, such as Ozrock Quarries, who are providing ballast, Mr. Speaker. They've already, those two businesses, benefited to the tune of around $7 million. It's going to create more than 15,000 jobs. And for Queensland, this is particularly important, Mr. Speaker, because of the $9.3 billion, they're going to potentially benefit to the order of $7 billion. This is infrastructure building at its best, and it's thanks to the Liberals and Nationals listening to people and delivering.
Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is addressed to the Prime Minister. Malcolm Turnbull has told the Prime Minister's colleagues, including the Minister for Communications and the Minister for Trade, that the government's climate change policy is incoherent and is holding back billions of dollars of investment. Does the Prime Minister agree with Mr Turnbull that it's time government members started acting like, quote, real Liberals and took effective action on climate change?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The government is implementing the policies on emissions reduction that began under Prime Minister Turnbull, Mr Speaker. Now, I take the interjection from the member opposite who said emissions are going up. Well, Mr Speaker, she's misleading, as the Leader of the Opposition did before question time, because emissions, Mr Speaker, have fallen in the 2018-9 year. That is the official evidence which has been provided by the quarterly update of Australia's natural greenhouse gas inventory, and that shows, Mr Speaker, that in the year to June 2019, economy-wide emissions fell 0.1%, or 0.4 million tonnes, to 532 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. Now, emissions are now lower than they were when the coalition government came to office, and they have declined each year since 2016-17, Mr Speaker. Emissions are 12.9% below 2005 levels, and, Mr Speaker, emissions per capita are at their lowest level in 29 years. And I note that in 2018-19, electricity generation emissions fell for the third year, down 1.2%. Now, Mr Speaker, we continue to implement the policies that were first commenced by Prime Minister Turnbull when it came to emissions reduction, and of course that has most significantly included getting on with the project of Snowy 2.0, which has been brought to a final investment decision by this government, Mr Speaker, and we continue to proceed with that policy, as well as the Climate Solutions Fund, which will mean that we'll meet our Paris targets, but importantly, Mr Speaker, we will meet the Kyoto 2020 targets, and we will be able to beat our commitments that we made. I correct the record, Mr Speaker, the commitments that the Labor Party made. The Labor Party made, Mr Speaker, and when we came to government, they were 700 million tonnes off achieving those targets. And so for Kyoto 2020, under our policies, we will have ensured that we beat the Kyoto 2020 targets by more than 360 million tonnes. Our policies are working, Mr Speaker. Our policies are working. On the other side, they cannot still say whether they are for the policy they took to the last election. They've had 6 months to deliberate. I tell you what, Mr Speaker, if you want to get rid of a policy you don't like, you can do it in week 1. This Leader of the Opposition has been holding on to those tax hikes ever since the election, just like he's been holding on to the 45% emissions reduction target, Mr Speaker. He just can't let it go.
Has the Prime Minister concluded his answer? He has. I'm doing everything I can to call an independent. It's proving difficult. The member for Kennedy.
Minister for Agriculture. Are dairy farmers receiving 58 cents a litre, 1 cent less than pre-deregulation 22 years ago? Wouldn't you agree that since Woolworths and Coles applied at their discretion 20 cents per litre, then clearly supply and demand is not determining price? Describing 6,000 sellers meeting 2 buyers as a free market, wouldn't, Minister, this be an ultimate hypocrisy? Surely you'd agree that anything less than a minimum price will ensure a continued decline and unspeakable cruelty on farmers, employees and all other persons that depend upon this industry.
The Minister for Agriculture.
No, Minister representing.
Minister representing the Minister for...
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and to the member for Kennedy, I respectfully disagree. And he will know full well from his time, the last time we had a floor price for an agricultural commodity was wool. And what floor prices effectively do, is they create an oversupply. They create an oversupply, and when you're talking about an industry that has a perishable product, you would be creating a cruel hoax. You would be creating a cruel hoax to what is a complicated situation, more so than the simplistic notions. I take the interjection from the member of Hunter, who, after his near-death political experience on the 18th of May by the National Party and One Nation, has found a conscience and a voice by giving a cruel hoax to those dairy farmers, but not tackling the problem with common sense and maturity. It is far more complicated far more complicated than that. Not only will you create an oversupply, but you will also recklessly put at risk the international trade agreements that we have put in place, not just for dairy, but for every other commodity. So if you're a beef producer in Kennedy, you will be terrified by the fact that this would tear away at the trade agreements that this government has put in place. We are a nation of 25 million people. We produce enough food for 75 million people. So if we don't engage with the world, we don't trade with the world, then you do not need rural communities, you do not need agriculture. So it's important that we have a multifaceted approach. One is around the mandatory code of conduct, one in which will be up in place as soon as the final consultation takes place. And it's important to ensure we get that right, that we don't have reckless actions like those opposite would do that would put at risk getting the mandatory code of conduct right. We're also putting in place a market platform that will allow dairy farmers, like other commodities, to be able to have more market balance, be able to trade their commodity like grain or cotton or any other agricultural commodity, giving the balance, equalising the balance within the marketplace. We've also created a unit within the ACCC to ensure that dairy is looked at in isolation and made sure that any market manipulation is dealt with by the regulator. But we've all got a role to play, and we've all got a role to play in making sure we fix this. Not just governments, and that's the actions the government's taking, but also processors and supermarkets. And the supermarkets, at my insistence, got rid of the $1 litre milk when I was Agriculture Minister, and they found a mechanism to get that back to the farm gate. So they need to lead, the Australian supermarkets need to lead with the Australian government and the industry to allow this transition of policy framework to take place, to ensure that the marketplace is equitable and viable for all dairy farmers into the future.
The member for Herbert.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the minister outline the Morrison government's achievements in protecting our nation from the evolving threat of foreign interference, and how the government will continue to work in a stable and certain way to keep Australians safe from this threat?
The Minister for Home Affairs has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for his question. His very genuine interest in what is a very important topic for our country. As the Prime Minister and I announced today, we're investing another $88 million into our national security and intelligence agencies to deal with the threat of foreign interference, and it builds on the $35 million that we provided in the last budget, and that's money that goes directly to ASIO, to the Australian Federal Police, to our agencies otherwise who are involved in protecting Australians. And I want to say in particular to the officers at ASIO, most Australians won't ever meet an officer from ASIO, I hope. Perhaps that's a good thing for some. You may never meet somebody from ASIS or from ONI, but you should be reassured that they are working to keep Australians safe. And when we saw the tragedy of what happened on the streets in London only within the last couple of days, we're very grateful for their work, of course, in relation to the counter-terrorism work that they undertake to keep our nation safe. But as important is the work that they do to protect our sovereignty, to protect us against foreign interference. And the money today will go toward not just ASIO and the Australian Federal Police, but also AUSTRAC. They've done an incredible job in recent weeks and months in enforcing the law here in Australia, but they are an integral part to looking at financial transactions, transactions that may give investigators a lead in relation to a counter-terrorism investigation or indeed to a counter-foreign interference investigation. But it also puts money, importantly, Mr Speaker, into the Australian Signals Directorate, the Australian Geospatial Intelligence Organisation and the Office of National Intelligence. And all of that support, Mr Speaker, will help keep Australians safe. There's a lot of work that our agencies have been doing with universities to make sure that we can deal with the threat as it may present on university campuses. And as we know, the threat of foreign interference has been with us as a democracy for many decades. It's a threat that exists in other Western democracies, and we need to make sure that we put extra investment in, and not just additional money, Mr Speaker, but an updating and hardening of our legislation, which the government has done on countless occasions on the advice of the agencies. And I want to pay tribute in particular to the Director-General of ASIO, Mike Burgess, and also the new Police Commissioner in the Australian Federal Police, Rhys Kershaw. Both of those leaders provide significant support to their frontline staff, and the other agencies that I've mentioned as well support the work of those two principal agencies. And the work of this government will never stop. We want to make sure that we continue to keep Australians safe, not just in the countering terrorism, but importantly, Mr Speaker, in the countering of foreign interference in our country as well.
Member for Solomon can keep walking, I think. The member for Solomon's about to get named if he doesn't leave the chamber. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Attorney-General. Was the New South Wales Police Commissioner made aware that the Attorney-General was on the call with the Prime Minister, which discussed the instigation, nature and substance of the criminal investigation into the Minister for Emissions Reduction, Strikeforce Garrett?
The Attorney-General.
Yes, he was, and I note that with respect to that call, he said the Prime Minister didn't ask me any questions that were inappropriate. I also note with respect to that call, he said something else very interesting. He said that matters like the one that was referred by the Shadow Attorney-General are, in his words, a great diverter of my time. And of course, the question goes to the nature of the interaction. So let's have a look. Let's have a look at some interactions. They don't like this, do they? Let's have a look at some of the interactions. How many political referrals do you think that you need to police in Australia where nothing comes of them before it starts to look like a negative, time-wasting interaction with the police? 2, 4, 6, 8. The Shadow Attorney-General has overseen and himself directly overseen 8 referrals to police of coalition members. And what has come of those referrals? Absolutely nothing.
Members on my right.
Nothing. So how many referrals until it starts to look vexatious?
The Attorney-General can resume his seat.
Stuart Robert resigned.
The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Order, Mr Speaker. This minister is the first law officer of the land.
No, you've just got to go to the point of order.
Well, is it appropriate that he be commenting in this way
No, you haven't
on an
raised a
ongoing
point of order.
investigation? I just find it extraordinary.
That is not a point of order, Leader of the Opposition. Just members on my right, the member for Barker, say to the Leader of the Opposition if he seeks the call on a point of order, he's got to immediately say what the point of order is. The Attorney-General.
So 2 of those referrals from the Shadow Attorney-General were about sitting Attorney-General. One with respect to the former Attorney-General George Brandis, in fact, one with respect to myself. And on 24 February 2015, the Shadow Attorney-General referred the then Attorney-General George Brandis to the AFP with an accusation of corruption and unlawful conduct. Now, in a proper sense, and in the real world not that long ago, if you referred a standing Attorney-General to the AFP and absolutely nothing came of it, you would have a question to answer. And what came of that referral? Absolutely nothing, just as it did from the other 7 referrals. In fact, the obsession that you had with George Brandis, you're like the Wile E. Coyote of referrals. And making the George Brandises of the world look like roadrunners isn't, the easiest thing to do. But he was looking over his shoulder at you going, beep, beep. There were 24 calls for George Brandis' resignation. And then again. The letter that the Shadow Attorney-General sent referring George Brandis to the AFP for corruption was so lame it couldn't even name the offence that was said to have been committed. At least when I got referred for bribery to the AFP, at least you were able to nominate the offence that you said was committed. But what came of that? Absolutely nothing. A serial offender in terms of vexatious complaints that waste the time of the AFP when the AFP could be using their time looking into things like drug dealing or terrorism or child sex offences. What a joke.
The member for Canning.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Attorney-General.
Will the Attorney outline the Morrison government's achievements in protecting Australians from dangerous terrorists and how the government will continue to work in a stable and certain way to keep Australians safe?
Great question.
The Attorney-General.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, because, of course, when the AFP's time isn't being wasted by the Shadow Attorney-General, they have the capacity to investigate matters like terrorism. That's what they do. That's what their real job is. And very sadly, the threat of terrorism is very real. We know in this place there have been 16 terrorist plots that have been foiled. We've unfortunately had 7 terrorist attacks. And, Mr Speaker, the tragic events in the United Kingdom, again on London Bridge, are obviously the subject of our country's deepest sympathy to the victims and to their families. But those events are also a very real illustration of a very real risk. And that is a risk that our government has acted very swiftly and strongly on to counter, and that is the undeniably high risk that individuals who have undertaken violent terrorist acts exhibit a very high tendency to re-offend. The evidence of that phenomenon in Australia is undeniable. Of the 30 Australians who fought and trained with extremist groups in conflict zones between 1990 and 2010, including Pakistan and Afghanistan, 25 returned, and 8 of those were convicted of terrorist-related offences. Very sadly, the recent London Bridge accused, Mr Khan, was in 2012 convicted for an al-Qaeda-inspired plot to attack the London Stock Exchange and to start a terrorist training camp in Pakistan-controlled Kashmir. The sentencing judge at the time described Mr Khan as a serious jihadi who should not be released until he was no longer a threat to the public. Now, right now in the Senate, our government's critical counter-terrorism bill is presently being debated, and that bill goes to precisely the type of risk that we've seen in this recent terrorist attack in London, and that is the risk to the community of people re-offending once they are released after they have had terrorist links or terrorist offending. And the government bill, Mr Speaker, the government bill ensures that anyone who has links with terrorists, who has shown support for other terrorist activities, will have a standing presumption against bail for other Commonwealth offences, and they will not be released on parole unless there are absolutely demonstrable exceptional circumstances. It also provides that continuing detention orders can be levied against the individual irrespective of whether the last day they serve in jail was on a state or on a federal offence. And, Mr Speaker, the absolutely critical nature of those laws arises from the fact that we have seen in England, in Australia, people who have links and who have offended with respect to terrorism have a high, very high risk of reoffending. And at the moment, there are 54 individuals serving sentences for Commonwealth terrorism offences, and 10 are due for release by the end of 2020. This is critical legislation and demonstrates how the government takes this issue with the utmost seriousness.
The member for Isaacs.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Attorney-General. I refer to the Attorney-General's confirmation that he was in the room when the Prime Minister called the New South Wales Police Commissioner about the criminal investigation into the Minister for Emissions Reduction. Before the phone call, did the Prime Minister ask the Attorney-General whether the phone call should be made? Did the Attorney-General seek advice from his department or agencies, including whether the Prime Minister calling the Commissioner one of his best friends gave rise to a further conflict?
The Attorney-General.
Mr Speaker, I was present during the call. It was a very short call. The descriptions of it, the descriptions— well, Mr
Attorney
Speaker,
will just pause.
Mr.
Members
Speaker,
on my left.
opposite.
The Attorney has the call.
Mr Speaker, the descriptions of that call provided by the Prime Minister and Commissioner Fuller have been absolutely accurate. But what I won't be lectured to about taking advice from someone who has an 8-0 record of referring coalition members to the police. 8 referrals, 0 success. Nothing. And what happens with the Shadow Attorney-General is the day the letter of referral goes off is a serious day in the media. We're up early and we finish late. We're before every radio person in Australia. We're on the front page of every newspaper with the very, very serious referral of the AG to the AFP, the former AG to the AFP, the other 6 coalition members to the
Member
police.
for Gorton.
But then the day when nothing happens, when the inevitable response comes from the AFP that this is a big, fat no, nothing to answer, no investigation, nothing, where is the silence? Absolute silence. And that's what happened with respect to those 8 referrals, isn't it? Isn't it, Member for Isaacs? No substance, no merit, no nothing. 8 referrals, nothing.
The member for Bass.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Industry, Science and Technology. Will the minister outline the Morrison government's achievements in backing Australian industry and businesses to grow and create more jobs, and how the government will continue to work in a stable and certain way to address issues of importance to Australian businesses and workers?
The Minister for Industry, Technology and Science.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for her question. And the member, like everyone on this side of the House, knows that the Morrison government is all about backing Australian workers, and we're doing that by backing Australian businesses, growing industries, so that we can create the jobs that we need for the industries of the future. Now, Mr Speaker, the Coalition doesn't see this as a zero-sum game. We don't see this as an either-or. We see this as an and, that we can back our existing core traditional industries at the same time as we can support and back our emerging industries. And in fact, sometimes it's very complementary, the existing and traditional industries and the complementary new and emerging industries. And the best example of this, Mr Speaker, is the mining sector, where we are one of the most technologically advanced in the world. And that's why NASA is so interested in working with our mining sector and looking at mining and remote operations. So what you can see is the existing business of mining working closely with the emerging industry of the space sector to grow business opportunities, to grow our industries and to create more jobs. Now, Mr Speaker, in the time remaining, I'd actually like to just run through a couple of the other areas where we are making sure that we are growing Australian industries, that we are supporting jobs of the future. Now, firstly, we launched the $160 million Manufacturing Modernisation Fund. Now, this provides grants of up to $1 million in matched funding to help our manufacturing businesses to upgrade and to ensure that workers are able to upskill. Secondly, we're investing $150 million into Australian businesses so that they can be part of NASA's Moon to Mars project. Now, this is part of our plan to triple the size of the space sector here in Australia so that it goes from $4 billion to $12 billion by 2030 and creates an additional 20,000 jobs. We're backing advanced manufacturers like X-Tech in South Australia, which I recently visited. They're looking, over the next few years, to hire 45 new engineers, technicians and machinists. We've engaged in the critical minerals industry. So we now have a formal agreement with the US on critical minerals. So Australian vanadium was given major project status in September this year. And in regional Western Australia, they will create 500 construction jobs and 240 ongoing jobs. And that's without me having time to even talk about hydrogen and the benefits that the hydrogen sector has in terms of exports and job growth here in this nation.
The member for Isaacs.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Attorney-General. I refer to the Attorney-General's previous answer. Did he seek advice from his department or agencies or not?
The Attorney-General has the call.
Mr Speaker, the phone call was very brief. The description of it—
Members on my left. Members on my left, the Attorney has the call.
The description of it by the Prime Minister was completely accurate. The description of it by the Police Commissioner was completely accurate. It was not the sort of phone call because it was so basic and simple that required any advice to be sought or given.
The member for Stirling.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister representing the Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment. Will the Minister outline the Morrison government's achievements in trade policy and how the government will continue to work in a stable and a certain way to address this issue of real importance to Australians?
The Minister representing the Minister for Trade and Investment.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Sterling for his question. And I know he, like a lot of members, will be taking great note at the Australian Export Awards tomorrow night, because there's a business, Imdex Limited, from his electorate which are up for an award, and I wish them all the best and all the other export businesses that are up for awards tomorrow night. Mr Speaker, since we came to office, we have concluded FTAs with China, Korea, Japan and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TP11. As the Prime Minister rightly said, we now cover 70% of our trade through our free trade agreements, providing stability and certainty for our exporters. And last week we took another step when we started finalising FTAs with Indonesia, Peru and Hong Kong by taking legislation through the Parliament. Now, this is incredibly important, and it's incredibly important because Australian businesses that export, on average, hire 23% more staff, pay 11% higher wages and have labour productivity 13% higher than non-exporters. So, i.e., our exporters help drive our economy. And when it comes to what's happening to our exporters, over 53,000 businesses are now exporting. 46,000 of those are small businesses. Now, that's an 18.5% increase since we came to office. That is why we are backing Australia's exporters. And this is creating more jobs, with 1 in 5 Australians employed in trade-related employment. And that is even stronger when it comes to regional and rural Australia. It's 1 in 4 in regional and rural Australia. And why do we want to continue pushing our trade agenda? Because we want to keep creating jobs. We've already created 1.5 million jobs, and our target, under the Prime Minister's excellent stewardship, is 1.25 million jobs over the next 5 years. Now, if we keep creating jobs, if we keep driving the economy through trade, we know that this will lift our productivity, it will lift wages, and that is what we're going to do. We're already looking at free trade agreements with the European Union, with the Pacific Alliance, Mexico, Chile, Peru and Colombia, and through the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. We're not going to rest on our laurels on this side. We've seen great success when it comes to trade. We've seen great success when it's come to creating jobs, and we're going to keep doing that every single day we're in office for the rest of this term and many terms to come, hopefully.
The member for Griffith.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Attorney-General. As the first law officer in this country and the minister in charge of drafting national integrity legislation, how on earth did the Attorney-General judge it appropriate for the Prime Minister to call the New South Wales Police Commissioner about the instigation, nature and substance of the criminal investigation into one of his own cabinet ministers?
Exactly. The Attorney-General.
Because the call was totally appropriate. It's precisely what the Prime Minister undertook to do. He did it. He came back to the House with the response to that call, and indeed it is precisely the description that Commissioner Fuller has given when he said that absolutely nothing inappropriate occurred in that phone call. But with respect to your question about being the first law officer, it is a responsibility. And there's someone over there who wants the job of First Law Officer, and that person has previously referred 2 First Law Officers to the AFP for investigation. And he's now looking down at his phone, maybe just trying to see whether or not there was any follow-up from those 2 letters. They were some time ago. Whose advice was being sought and received when the Shadow Attorney-General thinks that it's a good idea to send a politicised referral of George Brandis off for a charge of corruption to the AFP. Whose advice is being sought or received when the Shadow Attorney-General decides that it's a wise idea to send the President Attorney-General and myself off to the AFP for a charge under the Australian Electoral Commission, of bribery? Whose advice is being sought about that? And how many hopeless, no-response referrals does this Shadow Attorney-General have to preside over before a problem starts to tick on the horizon of the Leader of the Opposition? Because you are responsible for those referrals, all 8 of them. 8-0.
The member for Nichols has the call.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Water Resources, Drought, Rural Finance, Natural Disaster and Emergency Management. Will the Minister outline the Morrison-McCormack government's achievements in protecting our primary industries, including our forest industry, and how the government will continue to work in a way that guarantees jobs for Australians? And is the Minister aware of any alternative policies?
The Minister for Water Resources has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. And can I thank the member for Nichols for his question? And he, like the member for Gippsland in particular, and many regional Victorian members of parliament, have been appalled by the sudden cancellation and destruction of the native forest industry in Victoria. And it was done with the stroke of a pen, without any proper consultation with industry or community. This is one of the most sustainably managed resources in the country. And in fact, only 4 in every 10,000 trees in native forests in Victoria are harvested, and every one of those are replaced. They are replaced. And it's also an important aspect to our fire mitigation work in Victoria, in keeping Victorians safe, making sure they're protected during fire season. But what's more important are the 2,500 direct jobs that are going to be wiped out. That's on top of the thousands of jobs indirectly in the hardwood industry. Basically gone. The blue-collar workforce of regional Australia will be gone, decimated in one foul swoop. It also means that effectively we may be forced to import hardwood timber that isn't managed in a sustainable way that we in Australia can be proud of, that our native forests have been able to undertake in a mature and sensible way. But the Victorian government, they've come up with a solution. Their solution, and with some admiration, is to plant 50,000 hectares of plantation timber over the next 10 years. Unfortunately, the math doesn't add up, because they're saying we'll transition these jobs out of the native into the plantation. It takes 20 to 30 years plus for those trees to mature to a harvestable product. So those jobs are gone. There is no transition. That is a cruel hoax. It is a lie. It is a lie to those people that are hard-working, that are blue-collar workers. And I have to say, while I don't always agree with the member for Hunter, he has, in all honesty, shown the courage and conviction you would expect on this. And recently at the Australian Forest Products Association dinner, he called out the fallacy of Premier Andrews' claim that the hardwood timber industry in Victoria can transition to plantation by 2030. Australia cannot sustain a forest and forest products industry and all the jobs and wealth it creates without a native forest industry. That is the truth. That is what you would expect from someone that's meant to stand up for blue-collar workers, with the coalition members here that are going to stand shoulder to shoulder with those men and women, those communities that will be destroyed. And while they want to make noise over here, Mr Speaker, it would be great if they'd do the same as what the member for Hunter would and come out and knock the Andrews government for this callous and reckless decision to destroy the livelihoods of regional Australians and regional communities.
The member for Hindmarsh.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Emissions Reduction. On the 1st of August, the Minister told Parliament, and I quote, "All my interests are declared in accordance with the rules." Does the Minister stand by that statement?
The Minister for Emissions Reduction has the call.
Yes, Mr Speaker, I do.
The member for Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and my question is to the Minister for Housing and Assistant Treasurer. Will the Minister outline to the House the Morrison government's achievements in getting Australians into their first home, and how the government will continue to work in a stable and certain way to address the real issue of housing affordability, and is the Minister aware of any alternative policies?
The Minister for Housing and Assistant Treasurer.
will get shorter.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the member for Robertson for her question, because, like every member on this side of the parliament, from the Prime Minister downwards, we believe that every single Australian who aspires to own a home should be able to do so, and we believe that we should provide safe and secure housing where possible to everybody across the housing spectrum. In relation to first-home buyers, though, we are progressing with our signature policy that was taken to the election, the First Home Loan Deposit Scheme, a policy which will enable 10,000 first-home buyers to get into the market with a deposit of as little as 5%. We know on this side of the House that the big challenge for people who are trying to get into the housing market is saving that deposit. It's taking 10 years in Sydney to save a deposit for an average home, 8 years in Melbourne to save for that deposit. So this First Home Loan Deposit Scheme from the 1st of January will deliver 10,000 guarantees per annum to help those people into the market. This builds on the First Home Super Saver Scheme, which enables first-home buyers to save tax through superannuation, again to help them save that deposit more quickly. Shamefully, the Labor Party voted against the First Home Super Saver Scheme and promised at the election to repeal the policy. It's helped 5,000 first-home buyers accelerate their deposit. In addition, we are trying to support older Australians, removing the impediments to downsizing. We've had 6,000 senior Australians downsize from their family homes by contributing up to $300,000 into their superannuation fund, removing one of the biggest impediments to those people who are living in their family homes. Now, in addition to all of that, last week we had the National Housing Finance Investment Corporation issue a bond of $315 million, the second bond issuance of that amount, which funnels cheap debt into the hands of community housing providers who provide social and affordable housing throughout our country. In its first 12 months, it's delivered well over 1,000 additional social and affordable dwellings. Now, Mr. Speaker, that's what we've been doing on this side of the House, and I'm asked by the member for Robertson of Alternative Policies. And I suppose it's no surprise to the House that last week there was an article in the AFR titled "Labor's Negative Gearing Policy Not Dead Yet." Now, I noticed the Shadow Minister for Housing oh no, he's moved seat. There he is. The Shadow Minister for Housing is here. But the Shadow Minister for Housing is obviously in the corner with the Shadow Treasurer, fighting the Leader of the Opposition to hold on to those $387 billion of taxes. The Australian people delivered their verdict on your housing taxes, and I'd suggest the Leader of the Opposition speak to the Housing Minister.
The member for Hindmarsh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question again is to the Minister for Emissions Reduction, and I refer to his previous answer. Why then has the minister failed to declare his partnership shares in GFA F1 Proprietary Limited for more than 5 years?
The Minister for Emissions Reduction has the call.
Mr. Speaker, my interests are declared in accordance with the rules, as I have said many times in this House.
The member for Moncrief.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Population, Cities and Urban Infrastructure. Will the minister outline to the House the Morrison-McCormack's government achievements in delivering critical infrastructure across Australia and how the government will continue to work in a stable and certain way to deliver this infrastructure for Australians? And is the minister aware of any alternative policies?
The Minister for Population, Cities and Urban Infrastructure has the call.
Well, can I thank the member for Moncrief for her question? And just a couple of weeks ago, she joined the Prime Minister in delivering a further $157 million to the Gold Coast Light Rail Stage 2A, and that means that project can get underway right now, along with many other projects. Mr. Speaker, we would not be able to make projects like the Gold Coast Light Rail a reality if it weren't for our stable and certain economic plan. And it's this plan that has enabled us to carve out $100 billion of infrastructure funding over the next decade. And that means we're able to fund massive projects like the Gold Coast Light Rail, but also in other states, such as in Sydney with the WestConnex projects, which is providing 10,000 jobs, and people already using the M4, part of the WestConnex projects, are saving already up to 5.5 hours per week. The Western Sydney Airport is also underway, transforming the Western Sydney landscape as we speak. Inland Rail, another project under our $10 billion pipeline. As the DPM said earlier in the day, it's a $10 billion project underway and will transform the way freight is moved inside of Australia. The North Link in Western Australia. By the year's end, that project will be complete and will save commuters up to an hour every single week. Similarly, with the North-South corridor in South Australia, the first section is already done, saving people up to an hour a week, and with another 3 sections of that massive project is also underway. Mr Speaker, there are 130 major projects underway as we speak, another 140 in the planning phase, and these are only able to be done because we're able to manage the budget and fund things accordingly. And the contrast, Mr Speaker, was when Labor was last in office. Because they couldn't manage money, they stuffed the budget, they prioritised spending money on pink bats and school halls and sending cheques to dead people. It means they didn't have the money to fund these major infrastructure projects, even ones which they themselves said were critical, such as the Western Sydney Airport. And the Leader of the Opposition, back in 2009, he said in relation to the Western Sydney Airport, he said, "It is vital that we commence work now on the Western Sydney Airport." Nothing happened. He talked about fast rail uphill and down Dale, didn't put a cent towards it. He talked about the Inland Rail being absolutely essential. Again, not a sod turned. None of these big projects were able to be delivered. None of these projects were able to be delivered because they couldn't manage money. They stuffed the budget. They prioritised other things above infrastructure, and only the coalition can manage money and get on with the job of building.
Has concluded. The Leader of the Opposition has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm his emissions reduction minister has been embroiled in 4 scandals this year, routinely failing to disclose his interests, questions over an $80 million water purchase involving the former Deputy Prime Minister, not declaring shares in a company being investigated for poisoning critically endangered grasslands involving the now Treasurer, and a criminal investigation into the use of a fraudulent document involving the Attorney-General and the Prime Minister himself. How many more government members have to be dragged into this?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I can confirm that the Leader of the Opposition can't get a question out in 30 seconds for a start, but I can confirm this about the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction.
Members
He's
on my
introduced
left.
the default market offer, which puts price caps on for our electricity consumers, Mr Speaker. He is committed to establish the $1 billion Grid Reliability Fund, which secures Australia's energy future. He's delivered a $370 million investment into hydrogen and announced the National Hydrogen Strategy. He has put an end to dodgy discounts and late payment fees from the big electricity retailers. He's implemented the retailer reliability obligation. He's passed the big stick legislation, Mr Speaker, that was sought to be opposed by those opposite. So he took it to the election and they backed us at election, and the opposition rolled over, Mr Speaker. He delivered the Business Energy Advice Program. He advanced our gas reform package. He has established the Liddell Task Force. He's invested in 4 hydrogen and 1 bioenergy project, Mr Speaker. He's agreed to underwrite the New South Wales-Queensland interconnector. He's invested in 2 electric vehicle development projects, and he's opened formal negotiations with the US around access to the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, Mr Speaker, and that's just recently. So what I like, Mr Speaker, is we've got a Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction with emissions going down, Mr Speaker, who's getting on with the job, like all of my colleagues, getting on with the job, creating jobs, Mr Speaker, getting electricity prices under control, concluding trade agreements, guaranteeing funding for essential services in health and education, looking after our national security, protecting us against terrorists, ensuring we're taking action on countering foreign interference, ensuring we're taking action on waste management and getting plastics out of our ocean, Mr Speaker, bringing forward $3.8 billion worth of infrastructure investment to invest in our economy. For the last 6 months, Mr Speaker, and before then, our government has just been getting on with the job. Those opposite are just getting on with their grubby smears and political games because they can't face up to the fact, Mr Speaker, that they were given a message on the 18th of May that they don't want your higher taxes, they don't want your job-destroying emissions reduction targets, they don't want the fact that they blow a budget any time they see it. They were rejected, Mr Speaker, and they've been sulking ever since.
Just before I call the member for Higgins, the member for Isaacs is warned, and I call the member for Higgins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. Will the minister outline to the House the Morrison government's achievements in making critical medicines more available for Australians and how the government will continue to work in a stable and certain way to address this real issue for Australians, including those with cystic fibrosis and severe asthma?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Higgins, who comes to this place with a history as a distinguished paediatric physician. And amongst other things, she's aware of the importance of a stable and certain budget environment because in 2011 she witnessed as new medicines were deferred by the government of the day due to the fact that they had run out of money. As the budget of the day said, due to fiscal circumstances, the government will defer the listing of some new medicines until fiscal circumstances permit. And that included medicines for asthma and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. The medicine of Symbicort for asthma and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. However, I am delighted to say that under this government, because of the strong economic conditions which the Prime Minister and the Treasurer and the government as a whole have helped to support and helped to generate, we are able to list new medicines. And yesterday, the 1st of December, was PBS listing day. Yay. And some of the new medicines which we have been able to list include Orkambi and Symdeko. These are medicines for beautiful young children with cystic fibrosis, and these medicines would otherwise have cost $250,000. I met little Xavier at the day on which we announced this launch and the way in which his life had been transformed through early access. But there are numerous other children who will benefit as a result of this. But whether it's in relation to acute lymphoblastic leukemia and access to Blincyto at $150,000, whether it's in relation to Keytruda and access to medicines for lung cancer, which would otherwise cost $120,000, or as we announced only yesterday, access to Fasenra and Nucala for severe asthma. Access to Fasenra and Nucala for severe asthma, a medicine which would have cost approximately $20,000. And it is worth recalling that medicines for severe asthma were stopped, were blocked, were deferred because the budget ran out of money under Labor in 2011. By contrast, only yesterday, Fasenra and Nucala were listed on the pharmaceutical benefits scheme. Why does a strong economy matter? Because it allows us to give people the dignity of work. But why does it also matter? Because ultimately, at the heart of the government is the ability to provide essential services, so as what happened in 2011 never, ever happens again in Australia, as we saw
time has
only yesterday.
Concluded. The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm not going ill. We've done over 20 questions, Mr Speaker, and I ask that further questions be noticed.
Members on my left.
Paper.